I want to do this job because I see the people that are in people's best interest and the people that are not. And I really like the ones that are in people's best interest. So I want to do it correctly. I want to learn about it. I want to do it right. I don't want to just make money or even just give someone a good plan and grow their money. But then they don't ever know what's going on. Right? I don't want that. I want them to fully understand what is going on every step. So then one day, if they move away from BC and I can't serve them anymore, or if a family member comes to them and say, hey, I need help with my own finance, they will be able to take their plan, what they learned so far with me together, and then repeat some of these things back to their family members and help them that way.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to episode 10 of Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today we'll be discussing a very important topic, the importance of estate planning. What we'll be focusing on is the importance of having a will, understanding POA, and just making sure that your loved ones are properly positioned in the event that you were to pass away. We'll be discussing this topic with financial planner, Jacky Kuk. Jacky, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
No, glad to have you on. And I guess just for context for everybody who's in the conversation with us, we'll start by asking, who is Jacky Kuk?
Right. And before I start, I just want to say, Tanya and Brian, thank you so much for having me and also having this podcast. I think it does, provide a lot of value for everyone to understand the little things in every day and then how they can, improve and optimize their life. So thank you so much for having this program up.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Basically who I am, I'm a financial advisor and educator, and I aim to help people to optimize and understand their financial situations. You know how, for example, this field, it's very confusing. A lot of people from outside, when they look inward, they look at this and see a lot of unnecessary technical jargons or just unnecessary complication. That makes it very scary for people to approach their own financial situation. So basically what I do, for example, last client I just met, I basically broke down her retirement plan in a bite-sized piece that she was able to understand thoroughly. And she said even her niece, she could bring her into the conversation, and her niece who's in school would be able to understand my explanation as well. So that's basically what I do.
Awesome. And that's a good thing to highlight too, because I can't remember who it was. I feel like it was Albert Einstein who basically said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it. So
exactly. That's actually the kind of aim I go through. So funny enough is when I met my wife, like my wife had zero knowledge in the financial planning field. Like she doesn't want to listen to it. She doesn't want to know anything about it. So what I actually always do when I first started to make sure the way I explain makes sense is I would sit her down and say, okay, I know you don't want to listen to it, but let me explain to you once. And you tell me if you can actually, like, is it too confusing for you, right? So I would always use her as a guinea pig. And if she understands, then okay, then that's good enough for me to explain to other people, right? Or else then I have to go back and kind of rework my explanation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it works well. Like actually, and the reason why we end up bringing you on, I don't think I gave you this background, but we're doing a lot more, I guess, stabilizing of our finances, getting a solid foundation. And we have a pretty good foundation as it is. But one thing that we hadn't done was any estate planning. We hadn't put a will together. So I started looking around on the internet, and that's how I found you on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Watched a couple of videos. So I was like, this would be a good guy to talk to. And I know there's a lot of people in the same boat as us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Because you never think it's going to happen to you in your 30s, right? So
exactly.
So it's nice that we're being progressive and having this conversation. So I got to ask, given your experience, you have a good understanding of the importance of us protecting our assets in our family in the event that we pass away. A lot of us haven't given it much, if at any, thought. But we want to know what happens when we die from a legal perspective.
Right. And I think the hardest thing from my experience, personal experience, and also going through, selling an estate with clients is the hardest thing to grasp is how daunting the task of selling an estate can be. So a lot of us basically think about it as if, in the current situation when everything is good, no one passed away, we just say, okay, we can just walk into a bank, close an account, and it's very easy. But it's not like that when you're grieving, right? A lot of people probably can't even get out of bed for weeks, but there will be so much stuff, bills still have to be paid and waiting for the executor to do something with the estate. So I think that's the biggest part that people underestimate when it is the process while you're grieving. So I saw my parents go through this task when my grandparents passed away. And from my understanding, my grandparents' estate was extremely simple already. They're well set up, they have will. Everything was discussed and ready to go. But even then, it was extremely exhausting for my mom to handle and communicate with every family member because she was an executor. So I think that's a big part to keep in mind. Now, from a legal perspective, we are considered to have disposed everything we own at the moment we pass away, as if we sold everything. So all our assets could possibly trigger tax and debts could get called back. Now, there are exceptions. For example, if you have a surviving spouse, a lot of these things will roll over to that spouse, but there is nevertheless still going to be things that have to be distributed. And that takes a huge amount of effort and long process. And finally, in addition to that, even though with a will, distribution, it can lead to a lot of arguments. As I'm sure you all heard from stories, newspaper, and you watch TV shows, lawsuits is actually way more common than you think when it comes to selling an estate and distributing an asset. And some members is going to perceive it to be unfair. So a will, the downside with a will is that it actually becomes public once it gets probate. So anyone can pay a small amount and they can go through the will and find out what you put in there exactly, right? So in extreme cases, court could even overrule some specific instruction in a will. So imagine this is with a will. What happens if you have no will? How much more of a headache could possibly arise from just someone passing away?
Absolutely. And the one thing you mentioned there, you said, some of us think it's as easy as just going to the bank and canceling an account. One thing I've seen you mention in your teaching as well is just in relation to passwords and how important they are in the process. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Right. So password is extremely important. And actually, I think it's the one thing that is the biggest deterrence when it comes to initial phase. And it really sets turn a lot of people off because they might say, okay, I'm ready. Let's go close some accounts, but they realize they have no password to anything. And then the first step is to contact the banks, contact maybe your internet provider and try to have access to their account. But then the next question will be, well, you have to prove you're the executor, right? So then they have to jump through so much more hoops just to get the account open, just so they can possibly start the first process of paying off their bills or turning off accounts, right? So I think this is the part where, from what I observe from my clients, it really turns them off. Maybe they would try for 1 or 2 weeks and then they would say, okay, you know what, forget about it. I'm going to come back in 2-3 months because I just can't deal with this right now. And the thing is, every time you go through a conversation with someone about the person that just passed away, it just reminds you of that person again. So a lot of my clients just breaks down all over again. And it takes so much time for them to build back up to go the next small step just to move things forward.
Absolutely. Now, one thing as well, because a lot of times, and again, I mentioned this earlier, like, we hadn't planned that far ahead to have a will. And, for us, we're, towards the end of our 30s, we have 4 children. And I know there's a lot of people in that same situation as well who have a family and kids fairly young. So they're not, not necessarily thinking about the possibility of death. Now, there's a lot of potential problems that can come from not planning ahead. So what are some of the things that we're potentially leaving for our family if we don't have a proper will in place?
Right. And that's a great question. So the two biggest problem, basically, number one is designating an executor. So yes, without a will, most of us would just assume, well, my spouse is going to be my executor, which, yes, it will be, it can be, but without a will, it becomes a lot more difficult for that process to go through. Your spouse would have to go through the court to apply to be executor. And also another thing would be that you may want another family member, you have someone else in mind who might be a lot better with these things, and you much prefer them to handle or be a co-executor to maybe work alongside with your spouse, right? But they would not know this or not be able to do so if you don't have a will. So for example, I mentioned before, how my wife, basically don't want to know too much about financial planning and all that things. I'm still going to have her as an executor, She's going to do all these things for me if I pass away, but it's going to name my sister as a co-executor to go along with my wife, so she can assist her to get things done, so they can focus on getting all the documentation done. Now, the second problem is basically how your asset is distributed, like I talked about before. If there's no will, court will have you follow the provincial law to distribute. You may not want to be like that. Even if you are okay with the provincial law, the way they do things, you still want to have a will just to remove any confusion. Because a lot of family members, they might look at this and perceive and say, well, just because the law says so, it wasn't like that. Verbally, Jacky promised me 100,000, right? So I want my 100,000. Now, maybe they won't win because they have to go by the law, but it's going to create a lot of unnecessary argument and tension in the family. And I've seen a lot of family, the relationship break because of this, because over this one thing.
Right now, in a situation for somebody who has maybe, for us right now, it's a pretty simple scenario, but someone who maybe owns multiple businesses, has a lot of things like that going, would there ever be a situation where you may want to have maybe multiple wills, or at least a second one, just to help with some of the other things outside of your personal life?
Yes, absolutely. And this is in fact one of the things that I would always advise my client as soon as they have a corporation going. One of the things you definitely want to do is called dual will. So what would happen is, out of all the things you own, not necessarily everything has to be probated and go through a court. So if you have, and corporation is one of them, the shares don't need to be probated. It can be directly transferred to whoever wants to take over. So what would happen is you would want a will that's just for things that will get probated. And then another will is for things that don't need to be probated. So if you pass away, only the one that needs to be probated will go through court, and you will pay the probate fee, you will go through the process. But everything else that doesn't need to be probate can be passed on to your next of kin right away. That speeds up a lot of process, and it can save you a lot of probate fee.
So, power of attorney, we've all heard that term. Can you describe what that person's role is?
For sure. Basically, power of attorney is the right to act on someone else's behalf. Now, there are several types of power of attorney. A lot of people, we all just mix it all and just call it power of attorney. That's a general term, but each one actually have a specific use for different situations. So the key is make sure you're fully aware, what do you want to do right now? What kind of situation you're in, and what do you want to be done? And that could lead to a completely different power of attorney. Some actually, that's the complete opposite thing. So if you have the wrong thing, by the time something happens and you want to take out power of attorney and act on someone's behalf, you might realize that piece of paper doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything for you.
All right. And then just in terms of as doing a kind of a deeper dive, for those who may not understand, the POA, what is a power of attorney exactly?
Right. So there is two major groups of POA. Now there are a lot more, in detail, but in general, we can split into two groups. The first one is for when you're alive and well. This is the type of POA that you simply need someone to act on your behalf because you're not in the country. So maybe you bought a house and it's time to close, but you're stuck somewhere else. You need your spouse or someone else to act on your behalf and get things done. A POA, this kind of POA can do that. Okay. Now, this type of POA, however, to remember is it will automatically be revoked should you become incapacitated. So this is only designed for when you're alive and you can actually make decisions. You just couldn't be there in person to do so. This is what it's used for. And that's what I mean by make sure this is not the one you intended for when you're in bed, you're sick, you can't act, because this one will be automatically revoked. And this brings me to the second group. This is the one where you're incapacitated and cannot make decisions for yourself. Now, in this group, there are two main POA within. One is for health decision. So the other one is for financial decision. So you really want to consider the person you're about to name for each one. And it's a good fit to your role. So for example, like I said before, my wife will definitely be the health POA for me because I believe, she's going to think in my best interest and always going to care for me and choose the thing that I would have picked for myself health-wise when it comes to health decisions. However, for a financial POA, you might want to pick someone else if your health person is not as good with numbers or financial decisions. So maybe my sister would be my financial POA, right? She can do things for me that way. And then lastly, what you want to do is make sure whoever you name, it doesn't matter, but that person knows and aware they are the POA for you. And after you file a POA with your attorney, absolutely keep a copy for yourself and make sure the person that you're naming is aware where the copy is. And better yet, if you have bank accounts, you can also send it to a bank as a backup, just so when the person presents your POA, they can match it to the one you sent and they can get things going right away.
Yeah. So then there's no in between and having to wait for all that to be done.
Exactly.
Going back to the first example of a POA. So, like, if you're traveling and something goes on, now, is that a written agreement that your attorney would have, or is that just a conversation that you're having with that individual? I just want to clarify.
I think the best way to do it is just go through a notary all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. That way there's no argument. And a lot of times, most financial institution or organization probably won't take it anyway if it's not notarized,
Hmm.
because it could be like a forged document.
For sure. Okay. So then let's move on to beneficiaries. When looking for them, what are some considerations to put into place?
Right. So the three biggest pro of having beneficiary is, number one, you can bypass probate. That's a big one. Probate is not only time consuming, it actually costs you a hefty amount. So in BC, for example, for us, it's roughly about 1.4% overall. So whatever you have to be probated times 1.4%, and that's the fee you will have to pay. So, it's easy for someone to pay tens of thousands in probate fee. And having beneficiary, it will skip this whole process and pay out directly to the beneficiary you name. You skip the time, you skip the probate fee. Now, second benefit is that no one but you know who the beneficiary is of each account. So unlike a will, which I mentioned before, it will become public once it's going through probate. You can keep things very private with a beneficiary. And the last thing is the speed of paying out. Beneficiary can receive their fund as quick as 1 week. This can help alleviate a lot of stress and let family member focus on grieving. So without beneficiary, funds can take anywhere from 6 months to maybe even 3 years to be received if there are lawsuits or argument going on.
All right. And the other thing too, I just kind of wonder about is taxes, inheritance tax. And I think those are things that get overlooked as well. What's kind of best practice, to prepare people for those situations?
So one other thing you want to do for taxes is basically what we do is ask our client to name all the asset and liabilities on a paper, kind of like a balance sheet. And then from there, we will separate what needs to be taxed as income or capital gain. So let's say right now, today, you pass away tomorrow, then we will have a hypothetical scenario of how much potential tax will your family have to pay for you. Now, if you have a surviving spouse, maybe a lot of these can be rolled over and it's not too much of a problem. Then next comes the next conversation is, do you want to roll over some of these things? So for example, sometimes capital gain, all that stuff, it might make sense to roll over, but let's say your other spouse has a lot of capital losses that they can actually use. Well, maybe you would look at this and say, I don't want to roll over my capital gain because I have the loss to offset this. So why don't I make use of the loss right now? Because maybe I can't use it, in the future. Let's do it now and offset the tax. So those are some conversation that we would have. And then the next part would be to talk about future projection when it comes to potential gains, potential taxes, potential probate fee. Let's say your asset is growing at X amount of percent per year and you don't spend anything. What would that look like in the future? And are you okay with this? Is your family aware this is the tax bill you would have to pay? So sometimes I have conversation with a client. It's very usual because they have multiple rental properties, etc. It's very easy for their capital gain, all that stuff to add up to 400,000 or 500,000 and more. So that's something their kids will have to pay before they can inherit everything, or things will start to get auctioning off.
Okay. Now, I guess the other thing too is life insurance. For families, obviously, it's important to have in place. What would you recommend in terms of life insurance, and just to really help us understand why is life insurance an important thing to have?
Yeah, for sure. So there are three main purposes of getting an insurance. Number one is to protect against liability and income. Usually, this is the main thing when we're young and just have a mortgage and have family where we're raising. Number two is to create a legacy for the next generation. And number three is to create future income flow for yourself and use the insurance as a tax shelter investment tool. So those, depending on which you are looking for, you could have one purpose or you can have multiple or all three, that will really dictate what kind of product you're looking at. The biggest advice is really to find someone that's willing to sit down and listen to you and discuss what you really want your insurance to do for you. So this is one of the things that I always do when I sit down with my client. Instead of telling them you need insurance, I would first ask them, okay, let's say you pass away today. So first of all, these are three purpose, right? Is there any of these that you think is important to you? So if they say, well, liability, right? Then next I said, okay, if you pass away today, then what kind of liability you want to cover, what kind of income you want to provide to your next of kin, and for how long. So from there, we have a good framework of how much are we even looking at to start with, right? And then we go from there. So that's why you really want someone to sit down and go through the process with you, because there are so many insurance products and each one have a very specific use. You really want someone to help the client to understand by categorizing them. And when it comes to getting insurance, you can, I talk about this in my YouTube as well. There are three ways, and it's the same as if you're getting a car. You can rent it, you can lease insurance, you can buy insurance. So if you're interested, you can check out the YouTube. I talk about in detail like the three ways and the pros and cons of that. Now, lastly, is many people have the preconception that only buy this type, or only this, or this other type is always bad, is a scam. They always kind of just have a preconception like this, and this is really not the right way to do so, and it will always narrow you down to one specific product, which is maybe not suitable for you. What you really want to do is about your needs versus your budget. So that's why I said find someone that's willing to listen to you is the key. So for example, last week I had a couple in their 50s, and first they're very adamant about buying a very expensive insurance because they talked to their last advisor, they talked to their friend, and they both say, hey, you should buy this, it's good for you. But then upon reviewing what they actually want, I just sat down and say, hey, what do you care about right now? Tell me, right? What's your focus right now? And they said their focus is to invest and grow their retirement account for the next 10 years because they want to retire within 10 years. And then they want all their liabilities to pay off within then, right? They're paying off very rapidly right now. So then I look at this and I said, if this is really what you want, you shouldn't buy such an expensive insurance. It actually is counterproductive. It doesn't get you where you want to be. So instead, you should get the cheapest term insurance, top up for the time being, just to cover your liability while you're paying it off. That makes a lot more sense. And you can invest the difference, into your retirement accounts, into your TFSA, and grow your money that way.
And I sometimes think of when it comes to life insurance and everything that goes with that, the last thing you want, God forbid, your loved one passes away, is coming to find out that person did not have the right type of insurance. Right.
Exactly.
And I think so that has always been a fear for me. Like we had recently switched our life insurance and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, I feel like I can breathe now and that we are covered and our children are covered as well, right? But depending on who you're getting this information from, you don't want to be caught off guard when that time comes.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, this is why I don't think there's a bad kind of insurance. It's just about what is your need, right? So the most important is find someone that is going to be very upfront with you and tell you, hey, you know what? This insurance is very cheap, but it's going to run out in 10 years or 20 years. And are you okay with this? Right? As long as you're okay, then it's a suitable product to have. So that's why communication is really the key here.
For sure.
Now, you bring up an important point as well, as finding a good person who you can trust to provide advice. Now, in terms of how things are run in Canada, and I'm sure there's a little bit of variance between provinces, are there governing bodies who oversee the practices of financial advisors to make sure that people are actually staying in line? Like I know in the US, you can make the choice of actually having someone who's a fiduciary, but I think in Canada, there's a lot more controls in place to make sure that, people are representing their clients well. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. So in Canada, we have all insurance agents. It's governed by the Insurance Council of the province you're in. So if in BC, then it's Insurance Council of BC, and they basically is the person that regulates all the licensing and testing and compliances. And in addition to that, they have something called the CE credit, where as you have to, it's called continuing education credit. So every agent has to prove and provide to prove that they have been studying, they have been keeping up with the industry in terms of their knowledge. So that would be really the main thing. Now, we don't really have the fiduciary kind of role in Canada. I know there has been a lot of talk of changing up the industry to really look at what US is doing and maybe do something similar, but we're still in the process of improving. But for now, your local insurance council would be the person that regulates everything.
And then in terms of, I want to kind of transition over to trust now.
Right.
Something whenever I've heard this term, I always think of someone who's just super wealthy and they have a lot to leave to their kids. But I'm just curious, when is it appropriate for someone to establish a trust, or even multiple trusts?
Right. So the biggest consideration is there's something you need to do with your estate. And what do you want to do with your estate, basically? It could be from a tax planning perspective or a control perspective. So other tools like will or beneficiary may not be able to do those things for you. So for example, a common use of trust is to do something called estate freeze, which is using the trust becomes the owner of the company's participating share. So the capital gain are triggered inside the trust, and that's give you a better tax planning perspective. There's something only a trust can do. So you need to ask yourself first or consult a professional first, because there's a lot of admin work and could be very costly when you set up a trust. Another example would be recently I have a client that upon talking to them, they say that, we have about 5 properties right now and we're looking to add more aggressively in our next 15 years. So we're likely going to go up to 10 or 15. And I'm thinking about, I don't want my kids to get all 15 when I die, because that's too much money. They would have to do nothing. They can just do nothing for the rest of their life, and I don't want that, right? So I want to control how they spend, right? A will is not going to let you do that. A will is just a one-time instruction, like who gets what, that's it. Then they're free to do whatever they want with it. So likely, but what you can do is you can control it via a trust. That has a lot more control. And again, that's private. So, 15 properties, that could open up for a lot of potential challenges from your relatives, or a long lost cousin that's popping up out of nowhere and say you owe him so and so. So a trust is also private. Nobody ever knows what's going on inside. It's just between you and whoever you name as beneficiary and trustee.
Awesome. Now, is there anything we haven't covered to this point that we should discuss further? I know we've hit on a lot of topics so far.
Yeah, so a couple of things is, number one, I would say is really tax, because, as Canada, we're famous for how high our tax rate is, basically. So we really want to pay attention to that. And this is also the number one thing I always talk to my client first before we consider growing our money, anything. Let's look at tax first. Let's try to pay less tax, or, save ourselves some tax first. So usually we educate our client when it comes to retirement. There are 3 parts to it. The number one is tax when you're alive, and also tax when you pass away. And then next is asset, and from growing your asset, how to regenerate the last part, which is income. So all 3 needs to be balanced and looked at to really come up with a good financial plan. Now for tax, something I want to touch up on is we consider that both tax that are paid when you're alive and also tax that's triggered when you pass away. And then make sure that client is fully aware of both situations and they know what is the potential liability there. So let's take TFSA, for example. That's a very common and a misconception that people have about TFSA is what they do is usually when they open TFSA, they would name their spouse as a beneficiary. Okay. Now, you actually should name your spouse as an annuitant and then name someone else as a backup for beneficiary. This actually gives you a huge future tax impact, because what happens is that if you name your spouse as a beneficiary, the moment you pass away, your spouse will get the money in your TFSA account. But this creates a couple of problems. Number one is the days that are still opening as a TFSA, so if the account hasn't closed yet, the money hasn't paid out yet, technically from CRA's point of view, it's no longer a TFSA because you passed away already, right? You sold everything already. So all the gains during those days, your spouse will have to pay tax on them. Mm. Now, second thing is that your TFSA room is lost forever, right? Because you passed away. However, if you name your spouse as a successor annuitant, you actually remove those problems, because instead of them just receiving the money and closing an account, they would actually directly take over your TFSA account. So now they own 2 TFSA accounts, and they would also take over your TFSA room as well. So it's their room plus your room. So imagine if someone has been contributing to the TFSA since they're 30, right? And then we get TFSA room every year as well. by the time we're 60 or 70, our account could easily be over 200,000 plus growth. That's a huge tax-free account that your spouse would probably want to hold on to if something happens to you. So this is one of the things that every time we look at someone's new TFSA account from elsewhere, we just ask, is your spouse a beneficiary or successor annuitant? And if it's not a successor annuitant, first step is let's just change that first, right? Immediately, you can save yourself a lot of potential tax in the future. So that's basically, I think tax is another thing we should be looking at.
Awesome. Now, one thing I'm curious about is, you talk about how you have this, you're well, basically in your family, you mentioned your sister is also someone who's really financially astute. What was it that really got you interested in the financial side of things? And was this something that was kind of discussed in your family growing up?
Yeah, so funny enough, this is actually something not discussed with us growing up, except for real estate, because my parents is very into real estate investing and researching about real estate, which is also why in my video I have so many topics on real estate. A lot of them is just coming from them. But other than that, they pretty much have never really brought up the term of financial planning. And they just say, hey, like Asian parents, focus on school, just study, get good grades. We talk about finance after, right? So what actually happened is during when I was second year into university, I was at SFU and I was walking by, I was trying to get a part-time job for myself. And I was actually recruited by a financial company. So I didn't even know it was a commission job. I just thought it was a paid job. So I didn't even know until I got hired. I signed on and I start going through the process and learning. I was like, hey, when am I getting paid? And they're like, what do you mean? This is a commission job. You don't get paid. I was like, oh, okay. But then the key was that as I was learning about this role and how things were done, I realized not only a lot of people don't understand what is really going on, right? The more I learned, the more I realized I don't know about this whole field. I also realized there's actually some people do it correctly. So just like there are good companies and bad companies, right? And then I start to be able to tell the difference. Like some people is really not out for their client's best interest. They're for their own best interest. And I start to be able to compare and look at things and say, you know what, I want to do this job because I see the people that are in people's best interest and the people that are not. And I really like the ones that are in people's best interest. So I want to do it correctly. I want to learn about it. I want to do it right. I don't want to just make money or even just give someone a good plan and grow their money. But then they don't ever know what's going on. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't want that. I want them to fully understand what is going on every step. So then one day, if they move away from BC and I can't serve them anymore, or if a family member comes to them and say, hey, I need help with my own finance, they will be able to take their plan, what they learned so far with me together, and then repeat some of these things back to their family members and help them that way. Because there's only one me and I can't serve everyone, right? So the best way to raise the standard of financial knowledge as a whole is really to educate another person so they can educate 10 more people. And I think because school really don't teach us about the finance, they don't even teach us about credit card, right? But they let you apply one when you're 18, but they don't teach you nothing about it. So by the time some people, it really breaks my heart when I first start. Most of my clients were students, and a lot of them, when I talk to them, they're 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 into credit card debt. And they just thought, pay minimum. It's okay, just pay minimum. It's fine. Yeah, my friend said it's fine. And they don't realize at 20%, 25% interest rate, that's a hole you will never climb out of. And it breaks my heart. I couldn't do anything for them. We tried consolidating maybe, but even then, right? Like, imagine how many more people out there is like that and not realizing what they're doing. Before they even begin their life, they basically put themselves in a hole already and they can never climb out of it. And that's basically really why I got started and I got serious about this industry.
And I can appreciate that because this is not a passion of mine, but I know that it's important for me to know, right? So like your wife, not the conversation I would sit around for willingly, but I know that it will help me, right? Because
Exactly.
God forbid, like if Brian's not around and I haven't, taken any of the information he shared with me, then what? Like I'm going to be lost, right? And usually that comes with going through grief and stuff. So it's not like that's not a time to learn, right? So it's good to learn it now so you can have it later.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and this is why once in a while I would sit my wife down and I start going through all the numbers with her and telling her where everything is and how, like if I pass away and you have, X amount of money and someone approach you, right? Because eventually someone else has to take care of your money, or you can do it yourself, doesn't matter. But if you want to go through someone, what are some things you should be looking as an advisor? I would know when another advisor is being genuine and true, and then I would educate her on, hey, these are the things you should be looking for. These are the questions you should be asking. And she will always say, like, why are you making me learn about that? I always say, what if I die tomorrow? What are you going to do right now? Right? Do you even know like where all the bills are? Right. So that's why I always make sure she's updated on everything.
Yeah, no, it's so good to know. And you're easy to listen to. So I picked up some good things.
Thank you.
Can we go back to the wills for a sec? So
Yeah.
you always hear people like, oh, when my so-and-so passes away, I'm going to get ABC, right? Now, can you clarify, because I don't understand 100% how it works. So if in that person's will, it says, okay, you get this house, you get this account, how does it work for taxes? And the reason why I ask that is because I've heard some people can't even afford what they're given and then they lose it. So if you
Yeah.
could clarify.
So in general, basically is when you pass away, you have to still file one last tax filing. It's called your final return. And during that time, that's when your family member, your executor will have to help you calculate all the things you dispose of at that moment. What are the gains? What are everything? So in most times, it doesn't matter who is getting what. It's all about, can CRA get their tax paid before they distribute, because they need to issue like a certificate of probate saying that, hey, everything is soft, this is good to go, before things could be distributed if it's going through a will and a probate. So this is when, if you are not well prepared, you might have a lot of assets. It might look great on paper, but you might be setting your family up for, hundreds of thousands or even millions of potential tax liability. And then what will happen is they would be able to look at your asset. They see it there, but they can't tap into it. They can't access any of it because, CRA will say, well, pay us first before we release anything back to you guys. So this is where the biggest problem, and this is where you see a lot of people scrambling to borrow money, to ask their other relatives for help just to settle the estate. And this is becoming more and more common because it's very common nowadays for someone to have 2 or more properties. And I'm sure recently how fast real estate prices have gone up, how crazy everything is. It's not a surprise to have an average family with a net worth over 2, 3, 4 million just by real estate alone.
Okay, that clarifies it. Thank you.
All right. Well, no, this has been good. This has been very educational. So for everyone who's listening into this conversation and is curious what you're doing, where do we find you online? What are you working on? What can we look forward to from you?
Yeah, so like I said, I have a YouTube channel where we upload one video a week on various financial topics. So just search for my name, Jacky Kuk. My last name is Kuk, and then you'll be able to find it on there. In addition, we do have a private Facebook group. It's called Get Smarter with Money, where people can request to join, and then they can ask more questions in there. We have about 3,000, I think almost 3,500 members in there right now, and there are questions coming in every day from anywhere from insurance, investment, mortgages, or even should I buy, sell this real estate? What do you think? Look at the numbers for me. So we have a lot of people spread across different professions, and they are often willing and able to chime in and give their perspective and their expertise. So it's great. So if you're interested, search for my YouTube or find us on Facebook. It's called Get Smarter with Money, and then you can join our group there.
All right. And just a reminder, that's Jacky with a Y, and the last name is Kuk.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Jacky. That was really informative, and I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for having this podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.